Amen. You may be seated. Good afternoon. You didn't think I'd get that, did you? Yeah, I checked the time right before I came out. So, man, I'm so glad that you are here this morning. I just want to share a couple of real quick things with you before I jump into the message. One is 2 weeks from tonight, or 2 weeks from today, Marquis Laughlin is going to be here in the morning services. In the morning, all three services, 8:30, 10 o'clock, and 11:30. He is going to do a dramatic presentation of the first half of the book of Revelation. Okay, so all three services that morning are going to be the very same. Then he is going to return that Sunday evening at 6 p.m., and he is going to finish the book of Revelation on that Sunday night. And everybody is welcome to that. So what I want you to know is if you only come in the morning, you're going to be left hanging in the middle of the book of Revelation. And I'm not sure that's where you want to be hanging. You know, I mean, I really believe you want to get to the end of the book of Revelation with him, and it's going to be incredible. So just mark your calendars for that if you're able to. Bring some folks with you that morning. It's just going to be a lot of fun for us to be together. And then I also want to say this. If you're new or kind of new around here, I'd love the chance to meet you at the end of the service. And so I'll just be hanging out on the porch as you exit. And I'm trying to learn some names today, so I've had a chance to meet some of you this morning. But I would love the chance to meet some more, or even if I met you this morning earlier, I'd love still a chance to talk a little bit, hear your story, maybe what brought you to Bluffton or even to Cornerstone Church. And then my very last thing, and I'm going to pick on Matt for just a minute, but I also want to say a big thank you to the guys in the sound booth, because it's more than the click of a mouse. And Matt made it sound like, oh, you know, but they've been dealing with some technical things because I made a mistake. And so they've been trying to fix it since this morning. And it starts with the click of a mouse. Okay. Very true. But Seth's been navigating some difficult things this morning. And so you got to be able to troubleshoot some stuff as well. But anyway, it's a lot of fun. And so we're just thrilled that we're a part of what God's doing here at Cornerstone. And I don't know if Matt said this or not, but I mean, we had like 49 people going through membership class right after this service. So that's really cool to see what God's doing. Praise him for that. So now, I don't know on a Sunday when you leave here what you take away. I hope that you're like, oh, that was the word, the message was so great, and the text was amazing. I mean, I'm just teasing with you, but most people walk away with this. Most people walk away with a story that we told, or you know, maybe the way that we've said something, because we're working at crafting some things a particular way so that they're memorable, those types of things. But last week was really an eye-opening thing for me, because I usually leave on a Sunday, and by Sunday night, I'm usually already planning next week. And so Sunday afternoons, I usually take a little nap, and then I start thinking through even the text that I'm preaching the following Sunday. And I don't really give that much thought to like this past week. But last Sunday, Matt preached, and he asked a question in that message that just stayed with me all week long. And I would be driving into the office, and I was thinking about that question. I was working through my sermon, and I was thinking about that question. And that question just kept coming to mind. And the question was this. He said, what does how I live my life say about how I live my life? Do you remember that question? If you were here last week, he asked that. He was talking about Ephesians 5, and he was talking about husbands and wives in that context. But he asked that question. I began to wonder in my own life about how I was living my life, and the way that I was responding at home, the way that I was interacting with my wife or interacting with my kids. And then that question would just keep coming to mind. What does how I live my life? How I responded in this moment, how I acted in this moment, if I was complaining at this moment, or if I wasn't loving the way that I was commanded to love, but it was like, how does that reflect the way that I'm living my life? And to be honest with you, it bothered me. I don't know if you walk away with things bothering you, but I realized that God has such an incredible work to do in my own heart. And then I started working through this week's message in the particular way that Paul says some things. And so I want to ask the question a little bit differently. So I want to ask you this question of, what does how I live my life say about who I live my life for? What does how I live my life say about who I live my life for? Because here's the reality of it for so many of us in our life is we live our life for ourselves. It's not, we all know better. If you've been following Jesus for any length of time, we know better than to live our life for ourselves. But for a lot of us, we're living life for ourselves. And so we might be in a marriage, and it's like the husband's mad, the wife's mad, and they're okay to be mad with each other. They're not going to work through the problems because they're holding on to what they believe, and they're holding on to what they believe, and neither one of them is going to budge. And maybe that's you this morning, by the way. Maybe you've been fighting this morning. You thought, he has a camera in our car, and he was listening to us on the way, and I wasn't. I just know that that's what begins to happen. We sort of, anybody ever dig their heels in? It's like, I'm going to dig my heels in. There's no way I'm not budging on this. And what that says, by the way, about you, this is going to hurt. It says that you're living life for yourself. And you're not living life for Jesus, for sure. If you would call yourself a follower of Jesus, you should be having a different perspective. You're just living life in this selfish manner in which you're trying to build up your own kingdom. Aren't you glad you came today? But the truth of it is, I mean, we all do that. So what does how you live your life say about who you live your life for? I mean, for instance, like Ephesians 5:22, right? So Matt was in there last week, and he says, for wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And some of you wives in the room, you're sitting there going, well, I don't want to. Do you know my husband? And I'm saying, I don't know your husband. But that's not really what Paul says. Paul says you're to submit to him as if you are submitting to the Lord. So how I live my life reveals who I'm living my life for. And there's a perspective in there. And see, the flip side is also true for husbands, because in verse 25 he says, now husbands, this means that you're to love your wives as Christ loved the church, and he gave up his life for her. And listen, I know some of you husbands, you're in the room and you're sitting there going, listen, but you don't know my wife. She's not all that lovely. And I really don't want to love her today. And again, I want to say to you, that's not what Paul's talking about. Paul is talking about that you're making a decision that as you follow Jesus, you're going to do these things. Because why? Because as you follow Jesus, you are living your life for Jesus, not for yourself anymore. And so the reality of it is, I mean, let's just all be honest, is wives, you're not that fantastic. Husbands, you're not really all that awesome, but you know who is? Jesus. And if you can get that perspective, if you can gain that perspective to know that even in the midst of the relationship that I find myself in, and this translates into other relationships as well, as we'll see this morning, but even as I walk through that, I'm beginning to realize, you know what? My husband really was a jerk to me this morning, but that still doesn't give me the right to disrespect him. Why? Because I'm not living life for my husband. I'm living my life for Jesus. And Jesus is worth respecting. And because he told me I can, even though my husband's not, or even though my wife is not. And now this translates into the other relationships, extends into the other relationships that we have. So if you have a copy of God's Word, turn to Ephesians chapter 6. And we're going to talk about two other kinds of relationships this morning before we finish this series called Walk This Way next week. But this morning we're going to start with kids and parents. All right, this is fun. So kids in the room, pay attention. My kids in the room, you better pay attention. So this is so good because what it shows us is how difficult, to me it is, how difficult it is to navigate through the different relationships that we have in our life. So you got marriage that you're navigating through. You got friendships that you're navigating through. You have parenting and child relationships, and then you have other relations. And you're just trying to figure all this out. And that's the deal. The perspective will begin to determine how you live your life. So he says this in Ephesians 6, children, obey your parents. Let's just stop. Can we just close in a word of prayer right there and just say, I feel like that's good enough. Just children, obey your parents. Why? Because you belong to the Lord. For this is the right thing to do. Now, this is the interesting thing. It doesn't say because your parents are right. And it doesn't say because your parents are awesome. It doesn't say because your parents, pay for the roof over your head, which is what a lot of us parents would like to say. It doesn't say any of that. It just says, listen, children, obey your parents. Why? Number one, because you belong to Jesus. That's the first and foremost thing. Like, you belong to the Lord. And then it's the right thing to do because why? Because Jesus said it. And any time that you find something in the scriptures that's so plain and so clear, it would make sense for us to pay attention to it. And so he goes on. He says, now, honor your father and mother. This just seems to be getting so good for parents right now. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment, what they promised from way back in the Old Testament. If you honor your father and mother, things will go well with you, and you will have a long life on the earth. Now, let me just dispel something real quick, because some of you are like, oh, so if I obey my parents, then I will live to be really, really old in my life. That's not what he's talking about. What he is talking about is, listen, if you will listen to your folks, and you will learn to navigate through life with some of the wisdom that they're going to impart upon you, then you will navigate through some of those difficult circumstances and difficult seasons. And your life, as a result of listening to your parents, will go a little bit better than if you had totally ignored what your parents had said. Now, this also assumes, it also assumes that your mom and dad are willing to impart these things to you. They're willing to open up their life and say, look, here's where I made some mistakes. Here's where I failed. And here's where, this is what I'm trying to help you from experiencing this type of a heartache or heartbreak in your life. So it's not a promise of long life, but it is a promise of being able to navigate through life a little bit differently. But then he says this, and now he turns his attention to fathers. And let me just say, I believe that there's this really special relationship that dads should have in their families. And so while I know that not every family has a father, and I understand that, I totally get that. And so this commands are for moms and dads together or separate. I'm just saying that I do believe that having a male figure in the house is going to change some of the ways that kids are going to interact. And that's some of the stuff that you see around. But he says this, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. And he says this because why? He knows dads. And I don't know if you're like that, but I'm a loud person, and I'm kind of passionate about certain things. And so I can come across with my children a particular way if I'm not careful. Now, fortunately, the Lord has balanced me out with an amazing wife. And so it's different. But he says, don't provoke your children to wrath by the way you treat them. Rather, here's the exchange, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. And it's just solid information there. They're looking at that and going, now, if I could just determine how I'm going to do this, if I could just figure out how I'm going to work in the relationship with my kids, then it would make a difference. And so Charles Swindoll, do you know who Charles Swindoll is? Everybody, okay, so he's a pastor, and he's, really smart guy, but he says this about do we have that? Keep going, one more. Can we go one more? Is it frozen? Okay. Charles Swindoll, basically, there it is, up there. So Charles Swindoll says, the idea is that through his overbearing actions, a father can push a child over the edge. Have any of you ever experienced that in your life? Okay. So not only failing to impart wisdom, but actually pushing a child away from wisdom. So what Swindoll is saying is, he's talking about this text, because this is from his commentary on the book of Ephesians. So what he's saying in this, he's going, look, dads, in the way that you interact with your kids, you have the potential to push them farther away than you do to drag them closer based upon how you're interacting with them. So pay attention to how you are instructing, how you are disciplining, how you are interacting with your kids in general. And then, so he goes on in this particular commentary, and so he lists he lists 10 different things that he says, listen, you should beware of all of these things in your life. And so he says, beware of unreasonable demands for perfection. Unreasonable demands for perfection. Can you think of that? Anybody got that? Who lived in that? Where it's like, I grew up in a culture like that where I had to be perfect. So one of the things that my wife and I tell our kids, and we just look at them and we say, look, if you're doing your very best, then that's okay with us. Like, we're not demanding 100s on all your tests and, straight A's and all of that stuff. And some of you are looking at me like, you are crazy. I'm like, I'm not. I'm not going to put unreasonable demands for perfection on them. They're kids, right? They're kids. So that's one. Then the second thing he says, beware of constant nagging over minor infractions. Ooh. You ever heard the phrase, pick your battles? You know what I'm talking about. So you're going to pick your battles in order for you to win the war. And so when you pick your battles, you're not nagging over minor infractions like your shoes not being put away where they should belong. And I know some of you are like, but they should know to put their shoes where they belong. And I'm with you on that. But really, is that going to be the thing that you're going to take hold of in order to push your kid farther away? And some of you want to push back on me, and that's okay. That doesn't bother me. But constant nagging over these minor infractions. Now, bigger infractions like, talking back to your parents or using language that you shouldn't be using, some things like that. There's some stuff in here that you've got to begin to navigate through in your life. So beware of that. Beware of not leaving room for freedom for expression or personal growth. Think about that. Not leaving room for freedom of expression or personal growth, which means this: don't kill their spirit. Kids, every kid is unique. Every child is unique. Every child has their own distinct personality, and you can't treat them the same. So I don't know how many kids are in your house. My wife and I have 5 kids, and each of our 5 kids is different. And I'm learning how do I deal with my oldest versus my youngest? How do I deal with even my oldest son versus my youngest son? Because all of them are different, and they're wired differently. So I have to be careful not to crush their spirit. And the way that I would do that is not leaving room for freedom of expression or personal growth. And I'm just going to dictate the terms of everything, which doesn't go well for anybody. Then he says, beware of lack of encouragement and affirmation. I'm a words of affirmation guy. So 5 love language, if you're familiar with that type of stuff. So mine is words of affirmation is my love language. And so I love to receive this. I'm not the greatest at giving this out. And so I have to be mindful of giving encouragement and affirmation. So recently I've started to have some different conversations with my kids. So this past Friday I was dropping one of my sons off to school, and I looked at him just as we were pulling up around the circle. I said, man, I just want to tell you I'm proud of you. And he looked at me like, well, why? And number one, he's 13, and he actually got out of bed and went to school. Right? So if you got a 13-year-old, that's a win for us. That's a big win for us and our family. So I'm just trying to encourage and say, look, not only do I love you, because I say that to them a lot, and they're like, okay, whatever, Dad. So I've tried to change the conversation to where I want to be encouraging and affirming in who they are as individuals. At least that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm not perfect, because you could talk to any one of my kids, and they're going to say, yeah, my dad said that today, but let me tell you all the ways he failed. And they'd probably be right about that too. I want to beware of harsh, unloving rebukes or cruelty. I don't want to go too far. And I'm somebody who I could fly off the handle pretty quick just based upon my personality. So I have to be aware of that, to be conscious of that. I want to be aware of physical or verbal abuse, that's one of those things we go like, this is a no-brainer. But this is happening all around us. And some of you, if you're in education or you're in the school system at all, you can tell the kids that are struggling with this because they handle and carry themselves differently than any other kids. And you have the opportunity, even in those relationships, to speak life into those moments. So, but us as parents and moms and dads, we got to beware of being verbally or physically abusive. We need to beware of inconsistent discipline. This is kind of one of those difficult ones. So, over the weekend, my wife yesterday, something happened in our house, and she calls me into the room because I had yelled at one of my kids. Now, not really yelled. I had yelled for one of my kids. Let me say that. Because he was upstairs, and it came to my attention that he had done something that he needed to receive some discipline for. And so my wife heard me call for my kid, and then she says, come here a minute. And so I went because, if you're a husband, you should go at that moment and listen to your wife, because she's who the Lord has brought into my life. Seriously, like she is a compliment to who I am as a person. And so she says, remember last night and how we didn't discipline because of that? So this is basically the same thing. So don't go flying off the handle at your son. And so I didn't. I told her actually what happened, and we had a little chuckle about it, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But what my wife was doing was Listen, you didn't discipline one of them on Friday night. And here on Saturday morning, the same thing's happening. So you can't choose to discipline the one over the other. And that's a tough thing, isn't it? And so we just kind of say, yes, ma'am, I'm listening to you. And we just went on with our day. So beware of that. And then beware of showing favoritism for one child over another. And do we have any babies of the families in the room? Any like, it's me? Okay, so the rest of you think that we're spoiled. We're not. Like the rest of you think that we were shown favoritism over you. We weren't. We're just wiser than you are. And here's what I mean. Seriously, and I know. We learned, right, from your mistakes. So us as babies of the family, we're like, okay, I'm paying, because I have 2 older brothers. And so I'm watching how my 2 older brothers are getting in trouble, and I'm realizing I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm not going to do that. So guess what? I didn't do that. So I didn't get in trouble for that. And so don't show favoritism for one child over another. And that's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because sometimes one of our kids is just so cute, and the other one drives us crazy. We've got to be mindful of those things. And beware of unfair or extreme discipline that doesn't match the offense. Okay, got that? These are tough. These are tough. And then beware of overprotective hovering that stifles growth. That's some of you in the room. And I'm just going to say this so that you understand it, but boys will be boys. Some things are just going to happen. Your kids are going to get scrapes and bumps and bruises and potentially even break a bone, because that's sometimes what happens. So don't be an overprotective, don't be hovering parents that don't allow your kids to grow up. Because we really, at the end of the day, don't you want your kids to grow up? Don't you want them to move out of the house? Don't you want them to be able to pay their own bills? Because I do, because Carrie and I got plans when they leave. No. Okay, so you just got to be aware of those things. And it's just so important for us in our relationships to realize dads, particularly dads in the room, we have great power and influence to shape our entire family, our wife, and our kids. And that's an awesome responsibility. And here's the thing. As we will follow Jesus, as we are determining that we're going to live our life for him and not for ourselves, as we're determined that we're living for his kingdom and not our own earthly kingdom, we're going to realize that it's going to be a game changer for us in our relationships. So, Paul is now going to turn his attention to another kind of relationship, and this one picks up in verse 5. So he says this: slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. And that's a tough one, so I want to address this. So slaves and masters, because that's a difficult one for us to swallow sometimes. But I want to say this: the slave-master relationship that he's talking about is a lot different than the slave and master relationship that we would have in our minds if we hear those words. So we hear those words and we think of great oppression and those things that happened, 100, 150, 200 years ago, and some of the things that were going on, even sooner than that. But back in this particular age, as Paul is addressing this, okay, this is how they were referred to, but it was also one of those things where a slave would be welcomed into the family as though he were part of the family. He would be treated as part of the family. They would be treated very well. They would even be paid. It would almost be like an employee-employer relationship that they would have with someone. So what I want you to know is that this is a very sensitive issue, and we want to be mindful of that, because we don't believe that slavery is something that should exist, right? However, we do believe that it is okay when we live in relationships as an employee and employer that we're going to navigate through that relationship in a way that's going to honor Jesus as we follow Jesus. Okay, and so I want you to think about this in regards to an employee and an employer relationship, and not as that slave and master that we would think of from the last couple of 100 years. Okay, so he says this: slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. He goes on, serve them sincerely as you would, and here he goes, serve Christ. You see this recurring theme through all of it? Because you're going to realize real quickly that people around you are not as great as you might think they are. But you know who is? Jesus. And so the whole mindset that Paul's coming after in all of our relationships, think about it. Wives, submit to your husbands as though you are submitting to Christ. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Right? Children, obey your parents because you belong to Jesus and it will go well with you. And then he's talking to slaves, employees. He's like, work hard, serve them with sincerity as you would, as if you were serving Christ. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. You know the old phrase, when the cat's away, the mice play? As a follower of Jesus, that should not be true of you. You should be working as hard when they're watching as when they're away. They should be the same. He goes on, as slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all your heart. That's a recurring theme that Paul brings into the scriptures. Work with enthusiasm. What a great word, work with enthusiasm. See, some of you hate your job, and I get it. But you've got to change that perspective. You've got to see things a little bit differently. Work with enthusiasm as though you are working for the Lord rather than for people. Why? Because, man, working for people is miserable, isn't it? I mean, if they're having a bad day, then you feel like you're having a bad day. Remember that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good that we do, whether we are slaves or free. And he turns his attention, he says, Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Don't threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites. How would your life be different if your perspective was, I'm following Jesus? Even in my job, even mundane task, whatever it is. I don't know, whatever it is that you might do. You might be someone who, you do clerical work and you're punching holes in things, or you're entering stuff into a database and all that. I mean, it doesn't matter whatever it is that you do. There's not one of us that's truly more important than the other one of us. But if we begin to treat each other in mutual submission, which goes back to what he said at the first part of this whole relationship thing, it begins to change our perspective of how we are to live our life. Because here's the thing, you're not supposed to live your life for yourself. You're not supposed to set yourself up as the king or queen of your universe. Because Jesus is. And we're submitting to him. And we're listening to him. And we're realizing that life goes better when we pay attention to what he is telling us to do. And as followers of Jesus, when we step into those moments and we are setting the example that he is calling us to set in the way that we live our life, when everybody else in the office is gathered in the break room and they're talking about what a bad boss that they work for, but you're not engaging in the conversation, there's something different about you. And as followers of Jesus, our life should be radically distinct from the way that the world lives. And we have an opportunity to step into those moments and say, I'm serving a different master, and his name is Jesus. So even though my wife may not be all that lovely today, I'm still going to love her as Christ loved the church. And even though my husband may have done some really stupid stuff and he's not worth submitting to and showing respect to, Jesus is. And even though my kids are driving me crazy or my parents are driving me up the wall and they're not worth following and they're not worth listening to, but Jesus is, it's going to make a huge difference in the way that we navigate through those relationships in our life. I want to leave you with two things just as we close. The first one is this. I want to encourage you as you go through all of your relationships that you maintain perspective. And here's the perspective. The perspective is, Paul wrote in Colossians 3 that we should set our hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father. And so our perspective is that we're not working for our own kingdom. We're not serving ourselves. We're not trying to put ourselves up on a pedestal. But we are putting Jesus there. And we are saying that Jesus is worth following. And Jesus is worth listening to. And Jesus is worth submitting to. And even though I don't feel like it sometimes in my earthly relationships, I'm going to, because how I live my life will reveal who I'm living my life for. And I want people to know that I'm living my life for Jesus. So I'm going to maintain that perspective. And then the second thing I just want to leave with you, just maybe a little tool, maybe will help you as you navigate through this, and it's this, that you need to determine who before do. And here's what I mean. Determine who you're going to live your life for before you go out and do something that potentially, let's just face it, when we respond, when we overreact, when we get into the heat of the moment and we don't take the time to pause and ask ourselves the question, who am I doing this for? Who am I living my life for? But instead we just decide that we're going to do. We're just going to say whatever comes into our heart in that moment. And listen, it can get pretty nasty. And then all of a sudden you're wondering, man, I wish I could really take back all of those things I said. You ever been there? I bet most of us have. At one time or another where we wish we could take something back. We wish we could respond, react, act differently than how we did. And if you'll pause, if you'll get into a habit of going, no, man, I know right now that I just want to whoop my kids up. But I'm gonna determine who. Who am I living my life for? See, if I'm living my life for myself, then I'm going to respond with myself. But if I take just a moment and I say, okay, I know that right now in this moment, the way that I respond has the potential to push my kids away, then I need to determine right now, who am I going to live my life for in this moment? Because it's not enough. Listen, I don't know if you've realized this as a follower of Jesus. It's not enough to make the decision one time in your life to follow Jesus. You've got to make that decision every moment of every day of your life. So that you can determine in that time, in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the argument, when things are just going sideways for you in your relationships, that you're going to determine who are you living your life for? And if you decide, if you've determined, if you've chosen that you're going to live your life for Jesus, then pause long enough to let Jesus be the one who comes through in those moments where your flesh wants to take over. And it can get so nasty, so fast. So determine who before you do. And I guarantee that as you do that, God will show up in ways you're gonna look back and go, I have no idea who that was, because that is not how I wanted to respond. And you're going to go, that's Jesus. Because that's what he does in us as we follow him. I'm going to ask you to bow your heads and close your eyes real quick. And I want to ask this question because I'll bet there's some people in the room who in your life, you have never taken the time to determine, who do you believe in? You see, I've told you this afternoon, I've said, look, Jesus is the one. He's worth it. Husband's not worth it. Wife's not worth it. Kids aren't worth it. Boss isn't worth it. But Jesus is worth it. And so if today you want to choose to believe in and follow Jesus Christ and you've never taken the time to do that in your life, I want to give you that opportunity, and it's real simple. I'm going to count to 3, and you're going to slip your hand up in the air. And then at the end of the service, I'm just going to direct you. There's a table in the back of this room in the middle, and Pastor Matt's going to be standing back there, and he's there. He wants to talk with you. He has a Bible that he would like to give to you as you enter into this relationship with following Jesus. So if today you want to make that decision, if you want to determine today the who that you're going to follow, and his name's Jesus, and you've never done that before, I'm going to count to 3, and I'm going to ask you to slip your hand up in the air. 1, 2, 3. Anybody in the room? Listen, as we close, our prayer team's going to be down front, and their little tables down here, and they're here to pray with you and for you and over you and whatever it is that you might be facing in your life. Listen, I know you might be struggling with relationships with your parents or your kids or your boss or your job and your marriage and all those types of things. And these folks are here they put a hand on your shoulder and they're just going to go before the Lord as their way of ministering to you. Let's all stand together. I'm going to pray, and we're going to sing this song that we sang just a few minutes ago called Build My Life. Why? Because we're going to determine who, and his name's Jesus, before we go out and do. Father, thank you for loving us. Thank you for being patient with us. Thank you for sending Jesus, Lord, to die on the cross, to take all of our sin, all of our shame, all of our guilt, and welcome us into your family. And help us as we leave, help us as we go, help us as we live life this week to pause and determine that we're living for him and not for ourselves. Thank you. Thank you for how you help us in the midst of those moments where we would otherwise fail so miserably. Thank you, Lord, for walking with us. And it's in Jesus' beautiful, matchless name we pray.